We live in an era defined by overlapping crises: global pandemics, rapid climate collapse, and the sudden integration of algorithmic logic into our daily lives have fractured the predictable systems we once relied on. For the field of design, a discipline heavily dependent on predictable methodologies, these forces have effectively shattered the traditional playbook. To understand the scale of this rupture, look at where participatory design started. In 1970s Scandinavia, the practice was built around a highly localized physical goal, empowering factory and office workers to design their own tools. The intention was to break down workplace hierarchies by putting the people who actually use the technology in the exact same room as the developers. That premise relies entirely on face-to-face democratic consensus. But when global health mandates enforce social isolation and artificial intelligence begins generating solutions autonomously, the physical spaces that made collaborative design possible vanish. This diagram maps exactly how the discipline is surviving this environment. It illustrates a dataset of 315 peer-reviewed papers published in top-tier international design journals. If we filter them strictly between the years 2020 and 2025, using the keywords co-design and participatory design, a very clear map of adaptation emerges. By subjecting these texts to rigorous thematic coding, assisted by AI synthesis tools to manage the immense volume of data, researchers isolated the specific pressure points. The resulting clusters reveal high-frequency terminology that was largely absent a decade ago: artificial intelligence, decoloniality, and vulnerable groups. The data reveals a complete mutation. Participatory design has largely abandoned its historical focus on creating consumer products in Western tech hubs. Instead, it has transitioned into a digitized, highly political framework used to mediate complex social issues. Hidden within these 315 papers are three distinct evolutionary branches: a shift in the tools designers use, a radical change in the populations they serve, and a theoretical overhaul of what design is supposed to achieve. The research proves that co-design is no longer a method for iterating a slightly better product. It has evolved into a vital survival mechanism for communities navigating volatile socio-technical systems. Before 2020, participatory methodology was intensely physical. The standard practice involved context mapping, bringing diverse stakeholders into a shared physical room to conduct highly tactile, face-to-face workshops. The defining artifact of this era was the wall of sticky notes. It represented a collective analog process of brainstorming, where the physical act of writing and clustering ideas created a shared sense of ownership among participants. The pandemic severed access to those rooms. Forced to maintain continuity during strict lockdowns, researchers and practitioners executed a sudden migration into low-contact digital environments. Collaboration became asynchronous. Traditional cultural probes, physical kits sent to participants to track their daily routines, were digitized. They morphed into instant probes, leveraging platforms like Instagram stories to gather real-time data. This shift introduced a new dynamic of passive empathy, where designers observe participants through screens rather than direct dialogue. Without physical prototypes to touch and discuss, the discipline adopted virtual and augmented reality. These digital environments function as new boundary objects, tools that bridge the communication gap between experts and laypeople. In urban planning, for instance, complex architectural blueprints are translated into VR virtual safaris. This allows non-expert citizens, including children, to intuitively navigate and critique unbuilt spaces, offering concrete input on environments they could never accurately evaluate on a flat sheet of paper. But the most significant technological disruptor isn't spatial, it's generative. Artificial intelligence is increasingly automating the actual form-giving stage of the design process, producing rapid visualizations and iterating geometries autonomously. This triggers what the literature calls the dematerialization of the designer. When algorithmic tools handle the material execution and visual production, the designer is stripped of their traditional role as a solitary craftsman. In this digital paradigm, the design professional transitions away from creating aesthetics. Instead, their primary function is to operate as an ethical facilitator, managing the volatile boundaries between human stakeholders and algorithmic outputs. While the tools of design have digitized, the demographics of the participants have also shifted. The 2020 to 2025 dataset documents a sharp pivot in exactly who is being invited to the table. The focus has largely moved away from standard middle-class consumers. Modern research concentrates heavily on vulnerable populations, aging individuals with dementia, autistic youth navigating sensory challenges, and refugees facing systemic displacement. Crucially, the literature insists these groups are no longer treated as passive data points to be studied from afar. They are integrated into the process as expert users, whose specific lived experiences dictate the boundaries of the solutions. This map tracks the geographic distribution of that dataset. It shows that approximately 35% of the analyzed participatory design studies are now conducted in the Global South, moving the center of gravity away from Northern Europe and America. We see this in extensive case studies across the African continent. Researchers are working alongside the San youth in Namibia, for instance, to build gamification models that are entirely rooted in local wisdom rather than imported educational standards. In Latin America, the focus frequently turns to tactical urbanism in vulnerable neighborhoods and post-conflict peacebuilding. In communities like Medellin, Colombia, residents use collaborative interventions to physically reshape dense urban topography and rebuild social trust. A parallel trend is the rise of indigenous self-governance in design methodology. These communities explicitly reject external, prescriptive solutions, demanding frameworks where they maintain total autonomy over how their resources and futures are structured. This pattern represents a major theoretical movement within the academic literature, the decolonization of design. In this context, decolonization means actively dismantling Eurocentric, one-size-fits-all methodologies. Researchers are replacing them with pluriversal design, approaches built entirely on local epistemologies, like the Latin American concept of sentipensar, which fuses thinking and feeling into a single analytical process. The most rigorous methodological innovations are no longer emerging from corporate tech hubs. They are being forged by marginalized communities, reclaiming the authority to design their own realities. While this geographic and demographic expansion appears highly progressive, measuring the actual depth of this participation exposes a severe structural failure. This is Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. First published in 1969, it serves as the academic benchmark for evaluating the spectrum of power dynamics in any collaborative project. The stated utopian goal of the discipline is to reach the top rungs. This is the zone of delegated power and citizen control, where participants actually possess the authority to execute decisions and manage their own environments. However, when we plot the actual results of the 315 papers from our dataset onto this framework, the outcomes fall short. The vast majority of these rigorous projects get trapped on the middle rungs, hovering strictly between consultation and partnership. This creates a paradox. If we possess advanced digital tools and sophisticated methodologies for engaging marginalized groups, why does true citizen control remain a statistical anomaly? The literature isolates two main barriers. The first is the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, paradox. When working with vulnerable populations, universities and governments enforce strict ethical oversight protocols. While designed to protect these groups from exploitation, these rigid procedural rules often require the project outcomes to be predetermined. This legally strips the participants of spontaneous decision-making power, capping the project at mere consultation. The second barrier lies within local governments and corporate entities. Bureaucratic departments and professional silos operate on risk-averse hierarchical models that simply refuse to share legal or financial jurisdiction with citizens. Furthermore, the methodologies themselves pose a threat. Integrating highly complex tools like big data analytics or TRIZ problem-solving often creates an immense cognitive load for non-expert participants. Instead of empowering them, this complexity reduces their self-efficacy, causing mental fixation and a loss of motivation. The evidence demonstrates that the ultimate barrier to democratizing design is not technological friction. The ceiling is created by institutional systems operating in self-preservation, maintaining their hegemony over the decision-making process. The most recent papers in the scoping review point to a final overriding shift. The very term participatory design is increasingly viewed as outdated, primarily because it remains strictly human-centric. A growing body of academic critique argues that traditional human-centered design is inherently flawed. By isolating human needs and placing them at the absolute center of every equation, the discipline has rendered the surrounding ecological and biological systems invisible. This visualization maps the transition to a more-than-human framework. It illustrates the demand that plants, animals, natural ecosystems, and even non-human algorithms be integrated as active stakeholders in the planning process. When the scope expands to include the environment and artificial intelligence, the definition of the designer must mutate. They can no longer act as isolated visionaries dictating form. They operate merely as connective nodes within a highly complex web. The contemporary literature explicitly states that the core competencies of a designer are changing. Aesthetic prowess and traditional drafting are being superseded by smart skills, the ability to facilitate negotiation, navigate conflict resolution, and provide strategic mediation between competing biological and institutional interests. Co-design projects are no longer product development pipelines leading to a marketable commodity. They serve as critical arenas for democratic interaction, spaces where citizens debate systemic issues and directly shape public policy. Therefore, participation cannot be accurately measured as a rigid linear ladder to be climbed. It functions as a fluid, constantly shifting ecosystem where power dynamics are continually negotiated across different stages of development. In the post-2025 landscape, the discipline has shed its industrial roots. Design is now the political act of constructing resilient frameworks where humans, natural environments, and autonomous machines can safely and equitably coexist.